What actually triggers us is rarely the situation in front of us. It's not the words someone says, the delay that frustrates us, or the mistake that throws us off balance. What truly triggers us is what those moments touch inside us. A reaction is born long before the moment itself. It comes from an old wound, an unmet need, a fear we haven't faced, or a belief we've been carrying quietly for years. The external event is just the spark. The real fire already existed within. When something triggers you, it often feels sudden and overwhelming. Your emotions rise fast. Your body tightens and your mind starts racing. But if you slow down and look deeper, you'll notice a familiar feeling beneath the surface. Maybe it's the fear of not being enough, the pain of not being seen, or the memory of being rejected or misunderstood. Triggers are reminders. They point to parts of you that are still asking for attention, understanding, and healing. They are not signs of weakness. They are signals of unresolved emotion. Most of the time, triggers come from expectations. You expect people to behave a certain way, life to follow a certain plan, or outcomes to match your effort. When reality doesn't meet those expectations, frustration and anger appear. But the pain doesn't come from the mismatch itself. It comes from the attachment to how things should be. The tighter you hold on to expectations, the easier it is to be triggered. Learning to loosen that grip doesn't mean lowering standards. It means freeing yourself from unnecessary emotional suffering. Another powerful trigger is feeling out of control. When life moves faster than you can manage, when uncertainty takes over, or when things don't go according to plan, your nervous system reacts. The mind wants certainty, safety, and predictability. When those are threatened, fear shows up disguised as anger, impatience, or defensiveness. Recognizing this allows you to respond with compassion toward yourself instead of judgment. You're not overreacting, you're protecting yourself the only way you know how. Triggers are also deeply connected to identity. When someone challenges your values, questions your competence, or threatens how you see yourself, the reaction can be intense. It's not about the comment, it's about what it implies. If you secretly doubt yourself, criticism feels like confirmation. If you fear being overlooked, being ignored feels unbearable. These moments reveal where your sense of self still depends on external validation. Growth begins when your worth no longer rises and falls based on someone else's opinion. What's important to understand is that triggers are teachers. They reveal where you still have work to do, not to punish you, but to guide you. Every trigger asks a question: what am I afraid of right now? What belief is being challenged? What part of me feels unsafe? When you start asking these questions instead of reacting automatically, something powerful happens. The trigger loses control over you. Awareness creates space, and in that space you get to choose how you respond. Healing doesn't come from avoiding triggers. You can't control every situation, every person, or every outcome. Healing comes from learning to stay present with discomfort without letting it define your actions. It comes from sitting with the feeling instead of pushing it away, from listening instead of fighting, from understanding instead of blaming. Over time, what once triggered you begins to lose its intensity, not because life got easier, but because you became stronger and more aware. When you stop seeing triggers as enemies, you stop fighting yourself. You realize that every emotional reaction is an invitation to grow. The moment you pause instead of react, you reclaim your power. You move from being controlled by old patterns to consciously choosing who you want to be in the moment. That choice changes everything. It changes your relationships, your peace of mind, and the way you experience life. You are not broken because you get triggered. You are human, but you don't have to stay trapped in reactions that no longer serve you. Each trigger is a doorway. On the other side is clarity, emotional freedom, and a deeper understanding of yourself. When you stop running from what triggers you and start learning from it, you transform pain into awareness and reaction into growth. And that is where real strength begins. What triggers you is rarely the situation itself. It's the unresolved emotions, past wounds, or hidden fears that the moment touches inside you. On the surface, it may look like someone's words, behavior, or a sudden event caused your reaction, but if that were truly the case, everyone would respond the same way. They don't. One person stays calm, another feels overwhelmed, another reacts with anger or shuts down completely. The difference isn't the moment itself, it's what the moment awakens inside each individual. Every emotional trigger is connected to something unfinished. It might be an old rejection that was never processed, a time you felt powerless, unheard, or unsafe, or a belief you formed about yourself long ago. When life presents a situation that feels similar, your mind doesn't respond to the present moment alone. It reacts as if the past is happening again. Your body remembers before your logic has a chance to catch up. That's why reactions can feel instant, intense, and sometimes confusing even to you. Unresolved emotions don't disappear just because time passes. They stay stored in your nervous system, quietly influencing how you interpret situations. A small comment can feel like an attack. Silence can feel like abandonment, and uncertainty can feel like danger. These reactions aren't weakness, they're protection mechanisms that once served a purpose. At some point in your life, reacting this way may have helped you survive emotionally. The problem is that what once protected you can later limit you. Hidden fears also play a powerful role. Fear of not being enough, fear of losing control, fear of being judged, fear of being left. These fears sit beneath the surface and shape your emotional responses. When something threatens these sensitive areas, your reaction is less about what's happening now and more about what you're afraid might happen. The mind fills in the gaps with old stories, and suddenly the present feels heavier than it really is. Understanding this changes everything. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" you begin to ask, "What inside me is asking for attention right now?" That shift moves you from blame to awareness. Triggers stop being enemies and start becoming messengers. They show you where healing is needed, where compassion is required, and where growth is possible. When you pause instead of reacting, you create space between the trigger and your response. In that space, you gain choice. You may still feel the emotion, but it no longer controls you. You begin to separate the present moment from the past wound. Over time, as you acknowledge and process what's been buried, the intensity of triggers fades. Not because life stops being challenging, but because you're no longer carrying old pain into new moments. Healing doesn't mean you'll never be triggered again. It means when you are, you recognize it as an invitation rather than a threat. An invitation to understand yourself more deeply, to respond with awareness instead of instinct, and to release patterns that no longer serve who you're becoming. When you learn this, triggers lose their power and you gain yours. Triggers often come from unmet expectations. When reality doesn't match how you think things should be, emotional reactions surface. Expectations are subtle agreements you make in your mind about how people, situations, or even life itself are supposed to behave. You may expect respect, understanding, appreciation, or fairness, and when those expectations aren't met, frustration, disappointment, or anger rises quickly. The reaction isn't only about what happened, it's about the gap between what you imagined and what actually occurred. Most expectations are unspoken. You don't always communicate them, and sometimes you're not even consciously aware you have them. You assume others will know what you need, how you feel, or what feels right to you. When they don't meet that invisible standard, it can feel personal, like a lack of care or intention. In reality, people are often acting from their own perspective, not against yours. But the emotional charge comes from the story you attach to the unmet expectation. This is especially true in close relationships. You may expect a partner, friend, or family member to show up in a specific way because of past experiences or emotional needs. When they fall short, it can reopen feelings of rejection, abandonment, or being unvalued. The moment becomes bigger than it is because it connects to something deeper inside you. What looks like an overreaction is often a buildup of unmet expectations that were never addressed. Expectations also extend to how life should unfold. You may believe that effort should always lead to reward, that kindness should be returned, or that progress should be linear. When life doesn't follow those rules, discouragement and resentment can appear. The emotional trigger comes from resisting reality instead of meeting it as it is. The mind argues with what happened, and that internal conflict creates stress. Awareness is the turning point. When you recognize that expectations are shaping your reactions, you gain the ability to pause and reflect. You begin to ask whether the expectation was realistic, communicated, or even necessary. Sometimes the pain isn't asking for others to change, but for you to release the rigid standard you were holding. This doesn't mean lowering your values or accepting poor treatment. It means separating healthy boundaries from silent demands. When expectations are clear and communicated, they become agreements rather than triggers. When they are unconscious, they become emotional traps. As you learn to meet reality without constant comparison to how it should be, emotional reactions soften. You respond instead of react. You create space for understanding, flexibility, and peace. In that space, triggers lose their grip. Not because life becomes perfect, but because you no longer rely on expectations to feel stable. Feeling a lack of control is a major trigger because uncertainty threatens the mind's deep need for safety and predictability. The human mind is wired to seek patterns, structure, and a sense of direction. When life becomes uncertain, when outcomes are unclear, plans fall apart, or situations move beyond your influence, the mind interprets that uncertainty as danger. Even when no real threat exists, the nervous system reacts as if something is wrong, and stress rises almost instantly. When you feel out of control, your thoughts begin racing ahead, trying to anticipate every possible outcome. The mind searches for certainty, but when it can't find it, fear fills the gap. This fear often shows up as anxiety, frustration, or irritability. You may become reactive, defensive, or overly emotional, not because the situation is truly harmful, but because your sense of stability has been shaken. The trigger isn't the uncertainty itself, it's the belief that you can't handle what comes next. Control gives the illusion of safety. When you believe you are in control, you feel grounded and calm. When that control is taken away, the ego feels threatened. It wants guarantees, timelines, and reassurance, and when those aren't available, it pushes for quick reactions. This is why people often try to control others, outcomes, or situations when they feel overwhelmed. The attempt to control is really an attempt to calm the internal discomfort. Uncertainty also activates past experiences. If you've been through situations where lack of control led to pain, loss, or failure, the body remembers. A current uncertain moment can awaken old fear stored in the nervous system. Even if the present situation is different, your emotional response may feel intense because it's layered with unresolved memories. The reaction feels urgent because your system is trying to protect you from repeating the past. Learning to work with uncertainty changes everything. Instead of trying to eliminate the unknown, you begin to build trust in yourself. You remind yourself that you have survived uncertainty before. You develop the ability to stay present instead of projecting fear into the future. As you focus on what you can control, your actions, your choices, your attitude, the mind slowly relaxes. When you accept that not everything needs to be controlled for you to be safe, your triggers lose power. Stress softens, reactions slow down, and clarity returns. Uncertainty stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like space. In that space, you find resilience, adaptability, and a deeper sense of inner stability that doesn't depend on life being predictable. Triggers are tied to identity because your sense of self acts like an emotional shield. When that shield feels threatened, the reaction is often immediate and intense. Your identity is built from beliefs about who you are, how you should be seen, and what makes you valuable. When a situation challenges those beliefs, it can feel personal, even if no harm was intended. The reaction isn't about the moment itself, it's about protecting the version of yourself you've learned to rely on. When your self-worth is closely attached to roles, achievements, or labels, anything that questions them can feel like an attack. A comment, a criticism, or even someone else's success can trigger defensiveness because it shakes the foundation of how you define yourself. The mind rushes to defend the ego, creating anger, shame, or withdrawal. This is why certain situations trigger you deeply while others don't. They touch a sensitive part of your identity. Identity-based triggers often come from comparison. When you measure your value against others, your self-image becomes fragile. Someone else's confidence can make you feel inadequate. Someone else's opinion can feel like a verdict on your worth. In these moments, the reaction is less about truth and more about fear. The fear of not being enough, of being rejected, or of losing significance. The mind responds by becoming defensive or reactive to regain a sense of control. These triggers are often rooted in the past. Early experiences, conditioning, and expectations shape how you see yourself. If you learned that your worth depended on being strong, successful, or pleasing others, then situations that challenge those traits can feel unbearable. The emotional intensity comes from an old survival strategy trying to keep you safe. The ego reacts quickly because it believes your identity must be protected at all costs. Awareness begins to loosen this grip. When you recognize that you are not your labels, roles, or external validation, triggers lose their hold. You start to see reactions as signals rather than threats. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you ask, "What part of me feels challenged right now?" That shift creates space between the trigger and the response. As you detach your worth from fixed identities, your reactions soften. You become less defensive and more curious. Challenges stop feeling like attacks and start feeling like opportunities to grow. When your sense of self becomes flexible instead of rigid, triggers no longer control you. They guide you toward deeper self-understanding and inner strength. Every trigger is a signal, not a flaw, because it serves as a mirror reflecting parts of yourself that need attention. When something sets off a strong emotional reaction, it does not mean you are broken or weak. It simply means that a certain belief, fear, or unresolved experience has been touched. Triggers act like signposts showing you where your inner work is required and where growth is possible. Instead of judging yourself for feeling anger, frustration, sadness, or anxiety, you can view the trigger as information and opportunity to understand yourself better. Triggers often reveal unresolved wounds from the past. Situations in the present can awaken old emotions that were never fully processed. A small comment, a sudden change, or a perceived slight may seem disproportionate, but the intensity of your reaction comes from layers of previous experiences. Your nervous system responds automatically because it remembers old threats or pain. Recognizing this allows you to respond with compassion instead of self-criticism. The trigger is not proof that something is wrong with you. It is proof that there is an area of yourself asking for attention. Awareness is key. Every time you notice a trigger, you gain insight into what matters to you, what you value, and where vulnerability exists. It highlights beliefs you may hold about yourself or the world that no longer serve you. For example, a trigger might reveal a fear of rejection, a need for approval, or a belief that you are not enough. By seeing these patterns clearly, you gain the power to challenge, reframe, and heal them. The moment you observe the trigger without judgment, it begins to lose its power over you. Self-compassion is another essential response. When a trigger arises, instead of shaming yourself for overreacting or feeling too much, you can acknowledge the difficulty of the moment and give yourself grace. Emotional reactions are natural human responses, and treating yourself with kindness allows you to process the feeling rather than suppress it. Compassionate awareness transforms triggers from moments of pain into opportunities for personal growth. Healing occurs gradually through repeated reflection and mindful attention. Each trigger presents a chance to examine your internal landscape and understand what needs care. Over time, as you address the underlying fears, unmet needs, or limiting beliefs, your triggers lose intensity. They no longer dominate your reactions, but instead become gentle reminders of the areas you have strengthened and the growth you continue to pursue. Understanding triggers as signals rather than flaws empowers you to reclaim your emotional freedom. They guide you toward deeper self-awareness, more intentional responses, and a greater capacity for patience, empathy, and resilience. When you embrace this perspective, triggers stop being enemies and become teachers, showing you exactly where healing, awareness, and self-compassion are still needed, and opening the door to a more conscious, peaceful life. When you pause, observe, and respond instead of reacting, triggers lose their power and become tools for growth and emotional freedom. Most of the time, triggers provoke immediate, instinctive reactions. Anger flares, anxiety rises, or fear takes over before you even realize what is happening. Reacting in this way reinforces old patterns and keeps you tied to the past because your nervous system interprets the moment as a threat. The key to breaking this cycle is creating a space between the stimulus, the trigger, and your response. In that space lies choice, awareness, and the opportunity to transform the way you experience life. Pausing is the first step. It's a conscious decision to stop the automatic reaction and take a breath before responding. This pause doesn't mean suppressing emotions or pretending the trigger isn't real. It's about creating enough distance to see the situation clearly without letting old patterns dictate your behavior. When you pause, you allow your rational mind and your emotional awareness to work together instead of being controlled solely by impulse. This small act interrupts the habitual loop of reactivity and gives you control over your experience. Observation is the second step. During this pause, notice what is arising inside you. What are you feeling? Where in your body does the emotion show up? What thoughts accompany it? Observation is not judgment, it is curiosity. You're gathering information about your internal state and the hidden patterns that the trigger has activated. Often you'll discover that your reaction is less about the present moment and more about past experiences, unmet needs, or limiting beliefs. By observing without condemnation, you gain insight into your own mind and begin to understand why certain situations provoke such strong responses. Responding is the final step. A response is different from a reaction because it comes from awareness rather than impulse. Once you've paused and observed, you can choose how to act in alignment with your values and long-term goals rather than simply satisfying immediate emotional urges. Responding might mean calmly expressing your feelings, setting a boundary, or even choosing to let the moment pass without taking it personally. Every thoughtful response reinforces your capacity for emotional regulation and shifts the power away from the trigger. Over time, this practice transforms triggers from sources of stress into tools for growth. Each trigger becomes an invitation to understand yourself more deeply, to strengthen your emotional resilience, and to cultivate greater self-mastery. You begin to see challenges as opportunities rather than threats. The more you practice pausing, observing, and responding, the more automatic this skill becomes and the freer you feel from old emotional patterns. Ultimately, when triggers no longer control you, you gain emotional freedom. You remain present, clear-headed, and composed, even in situations that previously felt overwhelming. What once provoked you becomes a teacher, guiding you toward greater self-awareness, inner peace, and conscious living. This shift doesn't remove life's challenges, but it gives you the power to navigate them with calm, wisdom, and choice.